The snow had already claimed the road to the village by the time the fever broke into something worse, and Marin Ashby understood, standing in the nursery doorway with a candle buttering in her fist, that no physician would come to Fenwick Hall before morning. The boy in the bed was 7 years old, and burning. His name was Thomas, and he was the only heir to a title and a fortune and a cold stone house that did not love him, and there was no one else awake in all that great pile of rooms who would carry him anywhere. She set the candle down. She pressed the back of her hand to his cheek and felt the heat leap into her skin like a live coal. And she did not let herself think about what it meant, because thinking would cost her the steadiness she needed. The nearest doctor lived 4 miles off, past the frozen ford in the village of Cobwood. 4 miles in a blizzard, in the dark, with a child who could not walk. She had carried heavier things than a small, feverish boy. She had carried grief that had no bottom. She wrapped him in the counterpane, and then in her own woolen mantle, and she lifted him against her chest, and she went down the servants' stair into the white and roaring dark. You may already be deciding what kind of woman does such a thing. Stay with her a while. The world of Fenwick Hall had decided too, and the world was wrong. Marin was 26 that winter, and she had been housekeeper at Fenwick Hall for a little under a year, which, in the arithmetic of that household, made her a stranger still. She had come with a plain trunk and 2 references, and a way of holding her spine that the upper servants read as pride, and the family did not read at all. To the household, she was Mrs. Ashby, because a housekeeper is always a Mrs., whether she has married or not, and the courtesy title sat on her like a borrowed coat. She was neither servant enough to be invisible, nor gentle enough to be seen. She occupied the thin, cold seam between the two, and she had learned to live there without complaint. The master of the house was away that winter, as he was most winters, and most springs and a good deal of the autumn besides. Julian Fenwick, Earl of Ravensmore, had buried his wife 3 years before and had not, by any account the servants could gather, slept a full night at Fenwick since he kept to town. He kept to the shooting seasons of other men's estates. He kept, above all, away from the nursery where his son grew up under the management of nurses and tutors and a housekeeper he had met exactly twice. The boy was raised by wages. The father paid them and stayed gone. What Marin knew of grief, she kept to herself, and it was a great deal. She had lost a household of her own once, in a manner of speaking, though she never spoke of it. She had learned that sorrow does not announce itself in a house. It settles into the corners and the drafts, and the way a man's coat hangs unworn in a cupboard for 3 years because no one has the heart to give it away. She had felt that settled sorrow in Fenwick Hall from her first week, and she had understood the boy at once, because a neglected child and a neglected house grieve in the same silent grammar. The snow was to her knees before she reached the ornamental gate, and past the gate there was no path at all, only the memory of one. Thomas had gone quiet against her shoulder, which frightened her more than his crying would have. She talked to him as she walked. She told him the names of things. "This is the Lime Avenue," she said, though the limes were only shapes of deeper black in the black. "This is where the deer come down in summer. This is the ford. Hold on to me. We are past the worst of it now, though they were not." The cold came through her mantle and her gown and the thin stuff of her chemise, as though she wore nothing at all. Her feet lost their particular shapes and became 2 aching blocks. Still she walked, and still she named the world for him, because a child must have something to hold that is not fear. Twice she went down. The first time was at the ford, where the snow had drifted over a hollow, and her leg went into it to the hip. And she twisted, and she felt something in her ankle give with a small hot certainty that she chose not to attend to, because attending to it would have meant stopping. She got her knee under herself, and rose with the boy still cradled, and did not let him touch the snow. The second time was on the far bank, where the ground climbed, and she fell forward onto her free hand and knelt there, a moment with her breath tearing in and out of her, like a saw through green wood, and Thomas stirred against her and said, in a voice gone thin and strange, "Are we nearly there?" And she said, "Yes, my love, we are nearly there." And she got up. because a child had asked and a child must be answered. The doctor's window showed a light. She would remember that light for the rest of her life. The specific yellow of it against the blue-white waste. The way it seemed to move toward her, though she was the one moving. It was the only warm color in a world that had gone entirely to bone and iron. And she fixed her whole failing mind upon it, the way a drowning woman fixes on a rope, and she counted her steps toward it, because counting was the last thing her mind could still be trusted to do. 40 steps. 30. She lost the count, and began again. She got the boy to the door, and she struck the wood with the flat of her hand because her fingers would no longer curl. And when the door opened, and warmth and lamplight and the smell of a living house poured out over her like a wave breaking, she said only, and then the floor came up to meet her, and the light went out. She did not faint from weakness. She fainted because she had at last permission to. By the time the Earl received the express and rode north through country still white and treacherous, the danger had passed. He arrived on the 4th day to find his son sitting up in a borrowed bed in the doctor's cottage, thin and pale and alive, spooning broth with the awful appetite of a child who has been very ill and is no longer. And he found in the low room beyond a housekeeper he could barely recall having hired, lying under a heap of quilts with both feet bound in linen and a fever of her own that the doctor described, in the careful voice menus when they do not wish to alarm appear, as not yet decided. He stood in the doorway a long time later. No one could tell Maren how long, because she did not wake to see it. Yet the doctor's wife told her weeks after that the Earl had stood at the foot of the bed of a servant he did not know, and had not moved, and had not spoken, and that his face, which she had always heard was cold, had not looked cold at all. It had looked like a man reading his own sentence. The season that followed was the coldest in living memory, and Maren spent the first 3 weeks of it insensible, or nearly so. She lost 2 toes on her left foot to the frost, which the doctor took with a swiftness she was grateful, afterward not to have been awake for. She did not lose the foot. She did not lose her life, though there were nights the doctor's wife sat up expecting to. When she finally surfaced into a room she recognized as her own at Fenwick, weeks had passed, and the snow had begun in patches to go. The first thing she understood was that everything had changed and nothing had. The household still ran. The fires were still laid. And yet there was a chair beside her bed that had not been there before. A good chair from the master's own library, and on the small table beside it a stack of books, and she was told in tones of great significance by the under-housemaid that his lordship had not left Fenwick since the night he arrived, that he had sent for the finest surgeon in the county to consult on her feet, that he had come twice to the door of this very room, and stood, and gone away again without going in. To the household she was, by then, a puzzle they could not solve, and puzzles in a great house are dangerous things. The Earl came to see her on the 4th day of her right mind, and she was not ready for him. She had expected a cold man. She had heard him described as cold by everyone who described him at all, and she had built from those accounts a figure of carved authority who would thank her in the manner one thanks a good tool for not breaking. The man who came instead stood too long in the doorway, as though the room were deeper than it was, and when he crossed to the chair, he did not sit in it. He stood behind it with his hands on its back, and she saw that his knuckles were white. Julian was perhaps 32, tall, with the kind of dark hair that will not be persuaded to lie flat, and a jaw held like a man holding something back behind his teeth. His eyes were a gray that went nearly to slate, and they did not leave her face. He was dressed for the country, a dark blue coat and no ornament, and there was nothing of the town about him except the way he had plainly not slept. "You are awake," he said. It was not a question, and it was not much of a greeting, and she understood in a saying of it that he did not know how to begin. "I am, my lord," she said. She tried to sit higher against the pillows and found she could not, and hated that he saw it. "Do not," he said. Then more quietly, as though correcting himself, "Please do not trouble yourself on my account." He looked at the bound shape of her feet beneath the counterpane and looked quickly away, and a muscle moved once in his jaw. "My son is well," he said. "He is entirely well. The doctor says there will be no lasting harm. He says it is owed to you. Everything he says is owed to you. I did what any person would have done." She said no, he said, and the word came out with a force that surprised them both. He mastered it at once. "No," he said again. "Level now." Any person would have sent a groom to wake for the doctor. Any person would have waited for the morning and the passing of the storm and the clearing of the road. You carried him 4 miles through it. The doctor says a quarter hour more and the fever would have taken him. You gave your feet for it. He stopped. His hands tightened on the chair. "I was in London," he said, and the sentence had no end that he was willing to speak, so he let it stand alone. And it was the most honest thing she had yet heard him say. She did not answer that. There was no kind answer to it, and she was not in the business of unkind ones. He stayed only a little longer. Before he went, he sat on the table beside the books. A small object she did not at first recognize, and when she took it up after he had gone, she found it was a child's wooden horse, its paint worn to bare grain at the withers, where a small hand had gripped it for years. There was a folded paper tucked beneath it. She did not open the paper that day. She held the little horse in both hands, and turned it in the light, and she thought about a father who did not know how to thank a woman, and had sent his son's most beloved thing to sit beside her bed like a sentry, and she felt something move in her chest that she had thought frozen for good. The paper, when she opened it days later, held 6 words in a hard black hand. It said, "I do not know your name," and beneath, smaller as though added after a long pause, "Thomas calls you the Snow Lady. She had a name." She had carried it out of a burned past into this cold house and kept it folded up small. She understood what the note was truly asking, which was not for her name at all, and she did not yet know how to answer that either. Spring came late, and grudging that year. The heir, restored, was a changed creature. Thomas Fenwick had been, before his illness, a quiet and watchful boy who had learned early that affection in his house was a thing to be economized. He came out of his fever, having decided otherwise. He attached himself to Marin with the whole undefended force of a child who has been carried through a blizzard by the only adult who ever risked anything for him, and no amount of propriety could pry him loose. He came to her sitting room. He learned to read faster, so that he might read to her while her feet healed. He brought her, one at a time, every treasure he owned, and told her their histories, and asked her to keep them safe, which she understood to mean he wished to have reasons to return. One afternoon he brought her a robin he had found dead beneath the library window, cradled in both palms with a gravity that undid her, and asked whether they might bury it properly with words said, because he had heard that people had words said. And so they went out into the thawing garden, the housekeeper and the heir, and dug a small hole beneath the espaliered pear with a coal shovel, and Marin said the word she remembered from too many gravesides, and Thomas listened with his hands folded and his face very still. And afterward he looked up at her and said, "When my mother was buried, I was not allowed to come. I was thought too young. Do you think she minded that I was not there?" And Marin, who had learned long ago that a child's hardest questions must be answered as though they were reasonable, because they are, said, "I think she minded nothing at all except leaving you, and I think if she could see you now, she would be glad you are a boy who says words over a robin." He considered this. He put his hand in hers. They went into tea. She should have discouraged all of it. A housekeeper does not become the confidant of the heir. She knew the shape of the disaster that lay at the end of that road. Knew it as clearly as she had known the shape of the ford beneath the snow. And she walked toward it anyway, because she could not make herself refuse a child who had been refused his whole life. His father watched. That was the thing she noticed first before she understood what she was noticing. The Earl, who had stayed at Fenwick, was a presence in the house now in a way he had never been, and where he was more and more was wherever his son and his housekeeper happened to be. He came to the library when they were in it. He appeared at the edge of the walled garden when Thomas was showing her the frog pond. He said little on these occasions. He stood at a small distance with his hands behind his back and watched his son laugh, and sometimes when he thought himself unobserved, he watched her. She told herself. It was gratitude. Gratitude has a shelf life, and it was outlasting its season. The staff began to talk. She heard it the way one always hears such things, in the sudden silences when she entered a room, in the particular quality of the curtsies she now received from girls who had been careless with them before. Mrs. Hardwell, the cook, who had been at Fenwick 30 years and had buried her own hopes long ago, took Marin aside one morning in the still room and said, not unkindly, "You want to have a care, Mrs. Ashby. He was ever a decent master, but decent masters have ruined decent women before now, and the world does not blame the master. I have seen it. I would not see it again in this house." And Marin thanked her, because the warning was meant well and because it was true, and because she had told herself the same thing in harder words and not listened. Into this the neighborhood arrived, as neighborhoods do, in the person of Lady Sybil Carrant and her mother, the Dowager Marchioness of Oldford, who had held before the late Countess's death a settled expectation that the Earl would in time do the sensible thing and marry Sybil, who was handsome and well dowered and had waited with what she considered admirable patience. The Earl's return to the country after 3 years of absence was, to the Dowager, a signal. She read it as a hunting dog reads a fallen bird. She came to call, and she brought her daughter, and she made it understood that the families would, of course, be dining together a great deal now that dear Ravensmore had come to his senses and returned to his responsibilities. Sybil Carrant was 23 and had never in her life been the second most interesting person in a room, and she did not intend to begin now. She was clever in the way of women who have been told their whole lives that they are the correct choice, which is to say she was clever about people's positions and dull about their hearts. She took the measure of Fenwick Hall in a single afternoon call and understood, with the swiftness of the truly self-interested, that the danger to her plans was not another lady of fashion. It was a housekeeper with damaged feet, whom the heir followed like a duckling and the master watched like a man at a window. At dinner that first evening, with the family and the guests assembled, and Marin present only because the Dowager had made a point of asking that the woman who saved the heir be permitted to hear the family's gratitude expressed, Sybil turned the full light of her attention on Marin and said, in the carrying voice of one performing kindness for an audience, "We have all heard of your uncommon courage, Mrs. Ashby. What a thing! To carry the child so far, one would almost think you had been a mother yourself. You managed it so naturally. Tell us, were you never married? Ashby to be proud of you." The table went still in the particular way. Tables go still when a blade has been drawn and dressed as a compliment. Marin felt the old wound open along its old seam. She kept her face. "I was married, my lady," she said. "I am a widow." And she said nothing more because the rest of it was hers, and she would not lay it on that table for the Dowager to turn over with a fork. "A widow," Sybil said, and let the word hang, and smiled. "Well, how fortunate for the household that your circumstances left you free to serve." And there it was, the whole judgment delivered in a single well-bred sentence that Marin was a woman without a place of her own, a fortunate accident, a useful nothing, who had been left free by misfortune to make herself convenient in a great house. The Dowager smiled into her wine. Down the table, Julian set his glass down with a click that was very quiet and very final, and did not smile at all. That night, Marin sat by her own small fire and held the little wooden horse, which Thomas had never asked to have returned, and she understood that she had allowed herself to be happy, and that happiness in her position was a debt that would be called in. She resolved to be careful. She resolved to withdraw. To be Mrs. Ashby the housekeeper and nothing warmer, to give the boy his lessons and the master his household accounts, and to want nothing. She held to it for 11 days. On the 12th, the Earl found her in the long gallery where she had gone at dusk to see whether the new maid had dusted the picture frames properly, and had stayed, when she found herself alone, to look at the portrait of the late Countess that hung at the gallery's dark end. The Countess had been fair and slight and painted with a spaniel in her lap and a look of gentle uncertainty as though she were not quite sure she belonged in her own gilt frame. Marin had been standing before it a long while when she became aware of him behind her. "You may look," he said. "No one else does any more. It is why I stopped coming to this end of the house." She began to move away, murmuring an apology, and he said no, and then gentler. "Stay." He came to stand beside her, not too near, both of them facing the painted woman. "She died when Thomas was 4, he said. Not of anything a doctor could name and fight. She had been failing for a long time before that. I was not, he said, and stopped. And she watched him make himself finish it. I was not kind to her. I was not cruel. I was absent. I told myself I had business, and I did have business, and I let the business be a wall I could stand behind. When she died, I understood that I had absented myself out of a marriage, the way a coward leaves a battle slowly and with excellent reasons, and by the time I turned around there was no one there to come back to. He looked at the portrait. I did not want to make the same country of my son, he said, and then I did. I paid people to raise him, and I called it grief, and I stayed away, until a woman I did not know carried him through a blizzard, and I understood what I had made of myself. It was more than he had said to anyone in 3 years. She knew that without being told. She stood beside him in the failing light, and did not offer him comfort, because comfort would have been a lie, and he would have known it. And instead, she said the truest thing she had, which was, a house that grieves teaches the children in it to grieve. I knew that about Thomas, the first week I was here. I did not know it was yours to mend. I thought it was only mine to make bearable. He turned and looked at her. Then fully, for the first time, without the barrier of his gratitude or his rank between them, and what was in his face she had no name for, and every name for, at once. It is bearable now, he said low. It has not been bearable in 3 years. It is bearable now, and I am afraid of the reason. And he did not touch her, though his hand had risen halfway from his side and stopped, and she did not close the distance, though every part of her that was still alive after the frost and the fever leaned toward him like a plant toward a window. They stood a hand's breadth apart in the dark gallery with the dead countess watching, and nothing happened. And everything did. She said good night. Her voice was not quite steady. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, with her healed and altered feet flat on the cold floor, and understood that she was in love with the Earl of Ravensmore, which was the most dangerous thing a woman in her situation could possibly be, and that he was, against all sense and against his own long habit of standing behind walls, in love with her. You know how the world receives such things. She knew it too. The dowager knew it first, and moved. She was not a stupid woman, and she had watched Julian across enough dinner tables to see the direction of his glances, and she understood that patience had become a losing strategy. If the Earl could not be steered toward Sybil, then the housekeeper must be steered out of Fenwick, and quickly, before a besotted man did something the county would never forget. The dowager had ruined servants before. It was an art she practiced without malice, the way a gardener pulls what has seeded itself where it ought not to grow. She began with the past, because the past is where a woman without protectors is always weakest. She made inquiries. She had a nephew in the law who had connections in the north, and she set him to learning what could be learned about a widow named Ashby, who had appeared at Fenwick with 2 references, and no history. And what came back to her, in a letter she read twice and then folded with great satisfaction, was this: that Marin Ashby had not merely lost a husband, that her husband had been a man named Corvin who had run a small school for the children of tradesmen, and that the school had burned, and that 3 children had died in the fire, and that there had been talk, in the town, ugly talk, of how the fire had started and who had left a lamp where a lamp ought not to have been. That the widow had left the town under a cloud she had never cleared, and had reinvented herself as a housekeeper 4 counties away, and had told no one at Fenwick a word of it. The dowager did not have the whole truth. She had the shape of it, which for her purposes was better than truth, because a shape can be filled in by any listener's worst imagination. She waited for her moment. She was a patient woman still, in the ways that mattered, and she chose the largest possible arena. The occasion was the spring assembly at Aldford, the first great gathering of the neighborhood after the long, hard winter, held in the Marchioness's own ballroom, with 200 candles lit, and the county's families in their finest, and the Earl of Ravensmore and his son among the honored guests. The dowager had contrived, with the ease of a hostess in her own house, that Mrs. Ashby should attend, ostensibly so that the neighborhood might at last properly honor the heroine of the winter. In truth, so that she might be broken where the most people could watch it happen. Julian had not liked the idea. Marin had liked it less. Thomas, though, had begged to go and begged that his snow lady come, and the dowager had pressed with such apparent warmth that refusal would itself have been a kind of statement, and so Marin went, in a grey silk gown that the Earl had somehow, without her ever catching how, arranged to have made for her the only fine thing she had owned in years. She knew something was wrong the moment she entered the ballroom. She had learned, in the burned town, to feel a room that has been prepared against her. The looks came too fast and slid away too quickly. The dowager's welcome was too tender. Sybil's smile had teeth in it. Marin stood at the edge of the great bright room with the candlelight breaking on 200 jewels, and understood that she had walked on her damaged feet into a trap laid with the patience of a whole cold winter. The dowager sprang it at the height of the evening, when the dancing had paused and the room was full and attentive. She rose, glass in hand, and begged the company's indulgence for a word about their celebrated guest. And Marin felt the floor tilt. "We have all made a heroine of Mrs. Talley. Ashby this winter," the dowager said warmly, "and it is right that we should honor courage. And yet I confess I have been uneasy. For it seems to me the county has taken a stranger to its bosom, knowing nothing of her, and a great house has taken her into its very nursery, its very family, knowing nothing of her, and I could not rest until I knew who it is we have all been trusting with our children." She turned to Marin with an expression of perfect concern. "Tell us, Mrs. Ashby," she said, "about the school, about the fire, about the children who did not come out." The silence that fell was total. 200 faces turned. Somewhere near the front, Sybil watched with her chin lifted, and her verdict already delivered in her eyes. This was the third time Marin had heard the shape of herself spoken aloud in that house's world. The widow, the fortunate accident, the useful nothing. And this time, it had been sharpened into something that could kill. Marin stood in the center of the turned room. She did not run. She had run once from the burned town and had spent 3 years learning what running costs. She looked at the dowager, and then she looked out at the county, and she found, somewhere beneath the fear, the same cold steadiness that had carried her across the frozen ford. "There was a fire," she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "My husband kept a school. On the night it burned, I was 3 streets distant, sitting up with my own mother who was dying and who died that week. My husband was in the school. He went back into it, twice, for the children who slept above the schoolroom. He brought out 4. He did not come out the 3rd time, and neither did the 3 he went back." For she stopped. The whole room held its breath. "There was talk afterward," she said, "because there is always talk, and grief wants a name to blame. And I was the widow who had not been there, and blame is easiest to lay on the one who lived. I left because I could not bear to hear my husband called careless by people he had died to save their children. I have never spoken of it, because it is not a story I can tell without giving it to people who will use it." She looked directly at the dowager as you have used it now, she said, without knowing one word of it to be true. It was a long speech for a woman in her position, and every word of it was true, and the room felt the truth in it the way a room always does, with a kind of collective shame that moves through it like a change in the weather. The dowager's face had begun, very slightly, to lose its shape. It was not Marin who ended it. Julian Fenwick had crossed the room. He had done it while she spoke, quietly from the far side to the near, and he arrived at her side as she finished. And he took his place beside her, so that they faced the county together. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "This is the woman I intend to marry," he said. 7 words. They fell into the silence and did not echo, because there was nothing in that stunned, bright room for them to echo against. Beside him, Thomas Fenwick, 7 years old, and understanding more than anyone supposed, slipped his hand into Marin's and held it, and the gesture was seen by 200 people, and it finished what his father's sentence had begun. The dowager's mouth opened and produced nothing. Sybil's chin came down. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman began quietly to weep, and it was Mrs. Zauberay. Hartwell the cook, who had come as a servant to serve and had heard everything, and who would tell the story in the Fenwick kitchen for the rest of her days. The county, which had come to watch a woman broken, found itself watching instead a woman claimed. And the county, whatever its faults, knew a true thing when a true thing was set before it, and it did what crowds do when the moral weather turns. It began here and there and then everywhere to applaud. Julian did not look at the crowd. He looked at Marin. "Forgive me," he said low, "for saying it here. Before I said it to you, I could not let it stand a moment longer than it had to. Know that I would say it again in an empty room, and I will, the moment we are out of this one." He offered her his arm and she took it, and they left the dowager standing in her own ballroom with her trap sprung shut on nothing, corrected before the whole county humbled, without a hand laid on her, which was the only justice the moment required, and more than she had granted anyone in years. He said it again in the empty room, as he had promised. It was a small parlor off the great hall, cold with the fire banked low, and he sat her down and knelt in front of her chair, which no earl should do, and which he did without appearing to notice, and he took both her hands. "I have been a coward in every way a man can be," he said. "I was a coward in my marriage, and I was a coward with my son, and I have been a coward with you, standing at doors and going away again, telling myself gratitude was all I felt, because gratitude asks nothing of a man. It is not gratitude." He held her hands hard. "I do not want a housekeeper. I do not want a heroine. I want the woman who names the world to a frightened child in the dark, so that he will have something to hold that is not fear. I have watched you do that for my son all spring. Do it for me. Marry me, and name the world to me. I have been cold a long time." She looked at him kneeling on the cold floor, this man of carved authority undone in front of her, and she thought of the little wooden horse and the note in the hard black hand that had asked, without asking, for her name. "Marin," she said. "My name is Marin," and she watched him receive it like a man receiving water, and she said, "Yes, yes, I will." He rose and drew her up, and for a moment they stood a hand's breadth apart as they had in the gallery. Only this time neither of them was afraid of the distance. And when he closed it and kissed her, it was soft and slow and full of every wall he had ever hidden behind coming down at once. And it was chaste, as such things go. And it was the least chaste thing that had ever happened to either of them, because it was true. They were married. In the small church at Fenwick, in early summer, without the county, with only the household and the boy and Mrs. Hartwell weeping frankly in the second pew, the dowager did not come. Sybil married, within the year, a baronet in the next county, and was by all accounts satisfied with the arrangement, and troubled the story no further. By the following winter, when the snow came again to the road to Cawood, Fenwick Hall was a different house. Marin had thought, in her first frozen year there, that some houses simply grieve. That it was in the stone. She had been wrong. A house grieves because the people in it do, and when they stop, so does the house. She learned this slowly, and then all at once, in the accumulated evidence of small things, fires that were lit now for warmth, and not only for order, a nursery that echoed with running feet, a master who slept the night through and woke in his own house on purpose. On the first hard snow of that new winter, Thomas begged to be allowed out into it, and was bundled to twice his size, and Maren stood at the nursery window and watched her husband carry their son out into the white on his shoulders, both of them shouting with the particular joy of people who have decided to be warm. On the sill beside her sat the little wooden horse, its paint still worn at the withers, which Thomas had given her that first spring and which she had never given back, and never would. She picked it up and turned it in the gray window light somewhere below. A father who had once paid other people to love his son was making a fool of himself in a snowdrift for the joy of hearing the boy laugh. And a woman who had carried that boy 4 miles through a blizzard because there had been no one else awake to do it, stood warm at last in a house that had decided, all the way down to its cold stone, to stop grieving and begin again. She set the horse back on the sill, where the light could reach it. Then she went down to meet them in the snow. If Maren's journey stayed with you, stay a moment longer, and leave a word about the part that moved you most, and then go and be warm with the people who are yours. Thank you for staying until the end.